Topic. I don't know exactly why I gave that topic, what I was thinking, and it's just wild. I'd much prefer to talk about this topic, biblical astronomy. As it so happens that coincidentally, I have a book out on the subject, and a shameless self-promotion. It's called The Created Cosmos. I know if you've been to the Creation Museum, that's also the name of the planetarium show we have there, but it has a subtitle, What the Bible Reveals About Astronomy. And what I've attempted to do in that book is take basically every passage in the Bible. Are we recording, by the way? That should stop me if we weren't. So take every biblical passage that deals with some astronomy phenomenon or object or something and just discuss it. And such a book has been written before, but it's been more than 100 years ago. A very famous English astronomer named E. Walter Maunder, and I've heard that name if you studied sunspots at all. He wrote a book around 1906 or thereabouts, 1905, first decade of the 20th century, on biblical allusions to things. And I've read the book a couple of times. It's I did it, downloaded some scan copy on the internet. It's been out of print for a very long time, and it actually is very well written. Product of his time. He wasn't a six-day creationist, as pretty obvious in there, but he had some things pretty right. He seemed to take Scripture very seriously. And nothing has been written since then, so I thought the time was right to kind of update it and put a different spin on it. So that's why I wrote it. I have a companion book coming out later this summer, not a sequel, but a companion book on, and don't ask me the title, I can't remember the title.
It's a great title.
But it's a book on creation astronomy. See, in this book I didn't really talk about the creation model much at all. I didn't talk about astronomy, at least the science, much. And I thought, well, some people reading the first book, I wonder, well, why didn't he talk about that? Well, that's what the second book is for. Again, a kind of companion to it. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today would be found in the book from last year. And the first thing I want to start off with is the references to, in the King James, is the firmament or in the heaven or heavens, plural. And if I'm repeating some of my other talks in places, which that's okay, I think, because the context is a bit different here. The word firmament occurs I think 17 times in the King James, because it's a translation of the Hebrew word rakia, which occurs 17 times in the Old Testament. And a couple of talks I've given since I've been here, I've talked about the fact that it's a little tricky trying to decipher exactly what that means. For one reason, it's just not used that often, and over half of the times that the word appears, 9 times, is in Genesis 1 alone. So trying to decipher what it means in Genesis 1 is kind of tricky when fewer than half of the other occurrences are elsewhere. And most of those others in Ezekiel are referring about something totally different, I think. So now you're down to a couple of mentions in the Psalms and one in the book of Daniel. Daniel's a little cryptic, and the Psalms, those are poetic books. So you don't have a whole lot to work with. That's why there are some disagreements, even among certain people in the room, about what that's all about on day 2. I'm looking right at you. I expect to hear from you when you read that chapter in the book. Okay. So, very good. Anyway, so it's a little tricky on these things. And by the way, the word, the translation in the older English versions, firmament, is really a terrible translation. The word heaven is a little easier to deal with. It's from the word shemayim, and it occurs 420 times in the Old Testament. That's a lot of occurrences, and most of those times, nearly 400 times, it's translated heaven or heavens. And now there's a little bit of ambiguity here, because it turns out, by the way, when I talk about the Hebrew here, I don't know Hebrew, but I do know people who know Hebrew, and I pick their brains quite a bit. And shemayim is a dual form. It means that there is no singular form of it. The Y-I-M ending, or the I-M ending, im, is how you make plurals, generally in Hebrew. And so it's a plural form. And in Hebrew it's no problem, because there's no distinction between the singular and plural then. But in English there is. And so trying to figure out how to translate that exactly is difficult. In the King James, I think Genesis 1, it's in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. And in many other translations, it's heavens and earth. Which one's right? Well, I don't know. Because there's no way of telling from the text which one is intended, is a singular or a plural. By the way, we have some words in English that are nouns that are sort of a dual form. Deer is one. You can have one deer, or you can have 2 or more deer. Now, how do you tell how many deer you're talking about? Well, if it's context, if it's a subject of the sentence, then the verb be singular or plural. And if you have articles with the a deer as opposed to those deers, those deers, those deer. Already did. Well, Hebrew doesn't work that way. And it turns out the only way to tell is really from the verb in the sentence. But that's only true if it occurs in the subject. I believe out of the 420 times, Shemayim only occurs as a subject twice. So it's a little tricky. It's always, definitely in Genesis 1, it is the object of the sentence, so we don't know on all of this. Again, it probably doesn't matter a whole lot as long as you're cognizant of the fact that you don't want to go to the mat on the fact that this particular translation makes it singular or plural. So be very careful about that. The word rachia, I like to repeat this in the other presentations, some of the other presentations I've done. The word rachia was translated into Septuagint. Remember, that's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament done in the 3rd century BC in Alexandria, a city of Greek culture and learning. It was translated as stereoma. And the stereoma is this hard sort of thing. It was this idea the Greeks had of this crystalline or transparent sphere with the stars impregnated on them. And it was an attempt to I believe it's an attempt to interpret, or even in this case, translate the Old Testament, Genesis particularly, in terms of the cosmology of that day. And that was a big mistake. In the few centuries later, Jerome in the Vulgate translated firmamentum, which is basically stereoma now in Latin. And when you got the early English translations, like the Geneva Bible and King James and other early ones, they just transliterated firmamentum into English as firmament, which gets across this hard thing. And it caused me consternation when I was in high school. I'm really interested in astronomy, so I started reading this thing carefully. I hit this firmament business. I'm thinking, what in the world is that? And it baffled me for the longest time. I guess I still baffle over it. But we've been bedeviled by just poor translations here. And the root of the problem is that people were trying to accommodate the cosmology, if you will, the science of the day. And so there are dangers here, there are warnings here, and lessons to learn. And unfortunately, people just go blithely on, stumbling into the same mistake again. And the big mistake today, vis-a-vis cosmology, is what? They want to interpret Genesis in terms of the modern cosmology, which is Big Bang. Okay, so there's a big lesson right there for us. I'll get off my soapbox now and move on. It's not my subject today. Now, stars and constellations, individual ones, are mentioned a few times in the book of in the Old Testament. One is the Pleiades. It's mentioned in Job 9:9 and Job 38:31, as well as Amos 5:8. 3 times it is mentioned. And the word there is Kima, which means to heap or to pile up. And you all familiar with the Pleiades? It's a star cluster. It looks pretty much like this photograph here without the nebulosity. Yeah, it's the Pleiades. And it's a prominent thing in the winter, high in the sky. At certain times of the winter, it's disappeared now because it's now summer. It'll come back soon, though. And it looks like a little pile, little clump of stars, because it is a cluster. So it's a good name in Hebrew for this particular thing. By the way, it's sometimes called the Seven Sisters. Anybody know what they call it in Japan? Subaru. Yeah, the oval with the 6 stars in that shape. Look at the Subaru symbol. It is the Pleiades star cluster. There's a telescope. The Japanese have the biggest one they have, called the Subaru telescope. And if you look at that, you might think it was underwritten by the Subaru Corporation. No, it's just the Pleiades telescope. If you got a Subaru and want to get a part for it, just go into the auto parts store and ask if you don't want like a fuel filter for a 2008 Pleiades and see what they say. You have to translate it into English, as it were. Now, interestingly enough, every time the Pleiades are mentioned, the Orion is also mentioned as well. It's a nearby constellation. You all familiar with Orion? It's one of the most familiar constellations. It's one of my 2 favorite constellations. You may say, well, how can you have 2 favorite constellations? Well, it's very easy. My other one is Delphinus. And whenever Delphinus is up, Orion isn't. And when Orion is up, Delphinus isn't. So no matter what time of day or night it is, or what time of year it is, I have one of my favorite constellations up. So that works perfectly there. And the word for Orion, it appears in all 3 cases. And by the way, they're close together in the sky, so it makes sense that you would put Orion and Pleiades together. And one of the most interesting ones there, the word used for Orion is Cassiel. Does anybody know what Cassiel means, or how it's translated other times? 70 other times it occurs in the Old Testament? Anybody know? It's one of two words used for fool, or adjective meaning foolish. For instance, in the 11 times it occurs in Proverbs 26, it's the word kasil being used there. Now, this is not the impious fool. This is the fool that simply acts foolishly or imprudently. Okay, so it's someone who's not particularly wise in doing things, but not the impious sort of fool. And tuck that away just for a moment, because that'll become significant here. Orion is a grand constellation. I've got a little reproduction here of part. Oh, that's actually Taurus. It's nearby. I'll come back to that. Taurus is real close to it. You can see the head of Taurus right there and the two long horns, and the Pleiades is right here in the shoulder of Taurus, and Orion's going to be over here. It's sort of in the trees. And this is the front leg down here. Does anybody recognize that particular image? Where does that come from? Lacan Cave in southern France. It's conventionally dated, what, 38,000 years or something like that. Of course, we would date it probably not even, maybe a tenth of that age. But I thought for years, I looked at that and I said, I've got horns right here, and look at this little group of stars right there. It looks just like the Pleiades. Even the location's pretty good. And I thought for the longest time, I thought, maybe that's a depiction of Taurus in the sky as well as the Pleiades. And if it is, I don't think too many people want to go there, because if it is conventionally dated to 38,000 years, that means that the Pleiades and Taurus are 38,000 years old, and I don't think anybody seriously believes that. So it's kind of an argument for more recent origin of these things. But I did some searching a couple of years ago, and I found out actually there are a couple of papers out there. Somebody else noticed before I did and decided to match them up. So it's pretty cool. I get some good ideas occasionally. When I get those good ideas, I usually find out that somebody else came up with it. I've had several ideas of fantastic inventions. I go to describe it to somebody, and he says, I thought of a neat device for I could invent for bleeding brake lines by yourself. Normally you need two people, but this is one person. And my friend used to work on auto parts, and he said, yeah, it's been invented. So I had these great ideas. It's just 20, 30 years a little late, a little too late. And here's a close-up of the Pleiades. Again, you can compare that depiction in Lacan to the Pleiades, and the shape is very similar to all of this. And nearby we have the constellation Orion. It would be to the lower left. There's a depiction of the constellation Orion. You can see here are the three belt stars. Those three belt stars point towards the face of Taurus. Down here is the location of the Orion Nebula. It's my second favorite thing to look at through the telescope. What's my first favorite? Not the moon. Saturn. Saturn's my number one. This is my number two. And the Horsehead Nebula is right there. I can barely make it out if I get it really close to it. And plenty of astronomers have told me that if they'd ever discover the other half of the Horsehead Nebula, they're going to name it after me. All right.
7 versus 6 stars in Pleiades?
7 versus 6? Well, actually, take your pick. There are hundreds of them.
I know, but isn't there an illusion of the 7 stars, but they're one of them supernovaed?
No, it's not supernova. What happened is the one of these, this one up here, Pleione, has faded a little bit. They think maybe a cloud has moved in front of it. But on a dark night, I can make out 7. I've seen as many as 14. That was a special night.
7 versus 6 doesn't date the...
No, we wouldn't have any idea when it would have faded, because if it is clouding that's moving in front of it, doesn't matter. Plus, again, dark sky, I can see 7. But 6 is more commonly seen by people.
Is there enough detail here that... since there's relative motion of the stars, does that put a constraint on?
No, it's just I don't think they were particularly good. There's more of an art thing than a star chart. Okay. I'm going to guess. If I were going to do it, I probably wouldn't do it that good myself. I can't be too critical. If I tried to draw things and by memory, because you got to look at this thing, go into the cave and paint it. Unless there was a dome somewhere in the cave at some point. Okay, identification with Orion. There's Orion. You can see his belt. Down the bottom, 2 bright stars are his knees. 2 bright stars up above that are his shoulders. There's a star above him, it's the head, and you've got a shield and a club over the head. It's really a cool constellation. It's big, it's bright, easy to find, easy to identify, and it actually looks like a man in the sky. We say here in the northern hemisphere he marches across the sky throughout the night, but in the southern hemisphere he cartwheels across the sky at night. He's upside down for them. Well, he has been identified with Nimrod, because in Genesis 10, 8, and 9, what does it say about Nimrod? He was a great and mighty hunter before the Lord, and Orion is the hunter. Now, I don't know if that's really ancient. Certainly by the Middle Ages, some of the Hebrews were identifying him with Nimrod. So we don't know how far back that goes, but he was a mighty hunter here. Now, some people see in this a type of Christ. There's an idea out there called the gospel in the stars. And how many people have heard of the gospel in the stars? There have been a slew of things written on that. It's rubbish for the most part. I'll be very blunt about that. I'll even sugarcoat it a little bit. It's rubbish. But at any rate, I've investigated it quite a bit. And they talk about Orion being this type of Christ up in the sky. And that's how they wax eloquent about this. And to me, that's highly offensive. The very word that God has chosen to preserve in the Bible for the name of Orion is Casil, not the impious one, but still an imprudent one. And excuse me, but Jesus is not a fool of either type. And that's the reason why I find this offensive. I find it blasphemous, and any thinking committed Christian ought to be stopped in their heels on that one. And to me, that's the proof text. I mean, that's the one thing that just slaughters and totally destroys the gospel in the stars. And yet I found people so committed to it that when I point that out to them, the first words out of their mouth after a slight pause is, yes, but. And they just go on blithely like it never happened. Are you listening? Are you listening at all? This is God's name for this. And yet well, anyway, off my soapbox once again.
You said it quickly. How far back does the reference to Nimrod come?
Clearly, Middle Ages. A lot of things we get from the Hebrews like this, the lore comes from the Middle Ages. I don't think we can trace it back any farther than that. It doesn't mean it doesn't go back any farther, but it's simply Middle Ages.
Sources, are they Christian sources?
No, I'm talking about Hebrew sources at this point. Rabbinic sources. It turns out there's a guy named Ibn Ezra in the Middle Ages. You've heard of him? And he was quite an interesting man. He was from the Iberian Peninsula, but he traveled a whole lot. And a lot of his writings reflect, generally people think he reflects Hebrew thinking, but I'm of the opinion that he probably introduced a lot of the Greek thought and Arabic astronomy to Hebrew audiences. Rather than reflecting Hebrew lore, I think he was introducing that lore to the Hebrews. Because we really don't have anything much to speak of about these things before Ibn Ezra. And that's late Middle Ages. But that's hard to prove on that point. This is what I concluded from my investigations of him. All right, there are other stars that are mentioned in the Bible. There's one one is used in Arcturus in Job 9:9 and Job 38:32, and the Hebrew word here used is Aish, and here's the constellation Bootes there. It's marked, and that bright star. You see the ice cream cone there in Bootes? That's how I recognize it. The bottom of the ice cream cone is a star Arcturus. And so a lot of people see this. A bunch of times I read it, I thought, well, Arcturus, that must be it. And I had a discussion with somebody recently and I had put a picture like this that I had taken, and I mentioned Arcturus, and somebody referenced and said, well, that star's mentioned in the Bible. And I said, well, let's be very careful about that, because it may not be the star. It may be the Big Bear. Big Bear is Ursa Major, which is Latin, but in Greek it's Arctos is the word for bear. Apparently the Greeks somehow tied bears to far north. We get the word Arctic from that. I wondered about that. I pondered it. Did they encounter polar bears at some point on their travels? I don't know, but somehow the word Arctic is related to that. So we believe that when they did the translation of this, they just transliterated it out of the Vulgate, which was Latin, and probably Jerome may have put down Arctos or Arcturus rather than putting in Ursa, which would be the bear. But most commentators who look at this think it's the Big Bear at this point. It turns out Arcturus, the star, is sometimes called Keeper of the Bears. That's what the name means. Arcturus is Keeper of the Bears because it is located near them in the sky and kind of lags with them as they move across the sky. Some people have even suggested that it was the Hyades star cluster. That's another star cluster. It's the face of Taurus the bull. That's kind of a minority viewpoint. There was a man named Schiaparelli. He was a famous Italian astronomer. He wrote a book about the same time Maunder wrote his book on references to the Old Testament. It was written in Italian and then translated into English. And Schiaparelli was a well-respected astronomer in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. This is the representation of Ursa Major. I'll be sharing some constellations with you here, the images. This comes from the Uranometria. It was published, I think, in 1608, goes back 400 years, and I think the most exquisite star chart ever done. A guy named Bayer, B-A-Y-E-R, did it. So here's Bayer's Bayer up in the sky here, if you can bear that. And so it's a really, really exquisite artwork. He's got all these stars plotted, and these stars are locations and are descriptions, and allowed him to draw these so accurately. Comes from Ptolemy, who around 140 A.D. wrote a complete compendium of ancient Greek lore, of astronomy. Everything we know about ancient Greek astronomy came from Ptolemy, just about everything. And he also included a catalog of, I think, 1,022 stars that he could see. And 48 constellations is handed down to him, and they were ancient already at that time. And so what he would do is he would describe each star and give its location in the sky in a coordinate system called ecliptic coordinates. And he would say this represents the right paw of the bear, or the left paw of the bear, or the right hip, or whatever, and would continue doing that. And so we can take those coordinates, we can identify those stars, usually without any ambiguity today, and so we can draw these things. It's great, marvelous comparisons you can make here. So this is as close as you can get to the ancient depictions. People in modern days take a little bit of liberties for this. Anyway, this is one of those things. It's a popular book. It's great artwork and so forth that you can find out there. Well, other stars and constellation names mentioned in the Bible. One is the word Mazzaroth, and it appears once in the book of Job, chapter 38, verse 32. And here we run into a slew of possible meanings. So we like the things to be so definite, but sometimes you get a one-word usage in something. It is extremely tricky. You go through commentaries, you go through what the Jews thought of their own scriptures and different translations. It's a mess, so trying to disentangle this is difficult. But there are several possible meanings we have. It's almost universally agreed that it refers to some constellations, probably plural, but we're not certain. It could mean all the constellations. It talks about, can you bring out the Mazzaroth in their seasons here? So it suggests maybe seasonal changes. Right now we have the stars of spring are fading away in the west. We're getting the stars of summer, and soon they will fade away to stars of autumn. These things change throughout the seasons. Some people thought it might refer to the zodiacal signs. We have running across here, you can see some constellations, Pisces and Aquarius and so forth. Those are the 12 zodiacal signs, and that is the part of the sky where the sun is found, and it changes month by month. And some people think that Mazzaroth might refer to that. Other people have even suggested it might refer to some unnamed, unknown particular star. That is an extreme minority viewpoint, and I don't share that. I like probably the constellations in general, or maybe some groups of constellations known for the different seasons. Again, only occurs once. And by the way, if there's a question or comment, feel like Kurt and just stop me at any point. And I should try to remember to repeat the comment or question before I comment on these things. There are other mentions as well. The word constellations appears in Isaiah 13:10, at least in the King James, and the word there is Casilium. Do you recognize what that is? It's Casil, which we said is the word for Orion, and it's got that plural ending on it. So it's talking about Casilium is talking about Orions, and Orion here sort of stands in for all the constellations. So the word used there, it's saying these things like Orion, these other constellations. So actually, that's a very good translation, I believe, the use there, and I don't think anybody disagrees with that interpretation on that point. So that's kind of cool. Orion is one of the most recognizable constellations, so it's good to be a stand-in for all of them, used in the plural form. And then we have planets. And the word planet is not going to appear in Scripture per se because, well, it's a Greek term, appears a bit late. It means wandering star. And there is a use of something like this in 2 Kings 23:5. It depends on which version of the Bible you use. The word there is mazlah. It's very similar to Mazarot, probably just we believe probably just a variation in spelling on this, perhaps. But it again, it's not clear what that means. Some translations say planets here, but many other people think it actually refers to the constellations or zodiacal signs once again. In fact, it might just be a complete corruption of the word Mazarot. I said Mazarot appears once, but this could be a corruption and could be a second appearance, but it looks like a different word. It's not at all clear what that means in the Hebrew. The word host of heaven also appears here. That appears from time to time in the Old Testament. And the host of heaven sometimes refers to angelic beings, sometimes it refers to constellations. In this particular case, I'm inclined to believe it refers to constellations, but who's to say? What about mentions of stars in general? Well, I'm glad you asked. The word kokab is the Hebrew word for star, and it appears 26 times in the Old Testament. And I find it interesting because the second brightest star in the constellation Ursa Minor, the small bear, is Kokab. Now, that's kind of interesting that the star's name, to me, means star, which is kind of weird. The brightest star in the small bear is Polaris, or the North Star. So Kokab is second. It's probably coincidental that it has that name, but it's interesting. And sometimes, several times in the Old Testament, the word Kokab and Koseh are put together, and the word Koseh means seer. So basically, it literally means star seer, which is translated stargazer. And there, it's talking about astrologers at that point. That gets tricky because until about 400 years ago, astrology and astronomy were mixed quite a bit. The Hebrews had to do some astronomy in the past, the ancient times, for calendars. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. The problem you have there is the fact that, well, how do you do that without meddling in the astrology? That's a really tricky maneuver. Today it's easy, but it isn't so easy back then. I'm a little perturbed, not enough to worry about, but a little that brings my notice that at the Creation Museum, the name of our planetarium is the Stargazers Planetarium. So I don't think we mean it as usually. Sometimes people call an astronomer a stargazer, but that's usually reserved for astrologers. Now you get to the New Testament, and the word there is aster. That means star, and it actually occurs 24 times. And of course, you recognize Aster. That's the name of some dogs in television and such, like Astro was the dog on the Jetsons. Okay, word astrology, astronomy, asteroid, all of these things come from that root, meaning star. And that occurs 24 times. So what specific uses did you find for the word kokab or aster? Well, we find them mentioned in verse 16 of Genesis 1. It's the only time in the whole creation account that God made the stars. And boy, am I frustrating. I'm a stellar astronomer, and you get it? Anyway, that's because I study stars. That's my specialty. And so I'm really interested in stars quite a bit. But yet it goes to the day 4 account. It talks about making these luminaries in the sky, and he specifically mentions this brighter light and a lesser light. And then almost it's like, and God made the stars also. Actually, and you have to fill in some extra words there in English. What it literally means, it says in Hebrew, is stars also. It's all it means. It's almost like, oh yeah, Danny, by the way, I made the stars on day 4 too. You figure out the details. And it's very frustrating. At the same time, it gives me a lot of freedom. I got a lot of liberty there to as long as I don't contradict Scripture, I'm pretty free to try different ideas in that context. So it is very frustrating that it's only mentioned once in the creation account, the most important part of creation at that point. So at any rate, well, I think I shared this yesterday. I'll share it again today. It's too good not to pass up. I'm a really hardcore creationist. How many people have heard me say this the other day? I'm a hardcore creationist. How hardcore am I? Well, they're kind of little passé now. But a few years ago, I heard about this Christian band called Third Day. And I thought, when I first heard them, I thought, what, they groove out on dry land and plants? Somebody had to explain to me Jesus rose on the 3rd day. I undoubtedly am the only person on the planet who misunderstood that. So if I had a band, what would the name of my band be? My band would be Fourth day, that's right. That's the cool day. And let's see, tomorrow is the fourth day, so we need a special celebration. That's a star day tomorrow. You know, they have this astronomy day they do every spring. I'm a stellar astronomer. They do an astronomy day every spring, and I thought about trying to come up with a Christian or creation astronomy day, but we'd have to do it on a Wednesday. They always do it on a Saturday. We can't do it on a Saturday. It has to be a Wednesday because God rested on the Sabbath. We want to do it the day that they had. So we need to pick our own date. My choice. Maybe I'll just set that up, the creation astronomy day, and have a big day. In the middle of the week, unfortunately for most people, to come out to the Creation Museum and see, look at the stars. Okay, so God made the stars. Also in Genesis 15:5, it says that the stars are innumerable. That's amazing. Stars are innumerable. Carl Sagan said that there are how many stars? Billions and billions. Turns out that was a gross underestimate. How many stars are there in the universe? Well, we used to say that we think that there was about 100 billion galaxies in the universe, but we think that's a low ball now. We think it's higher than that, but we'll take it as a minimum figure. 100 billion galaxies, and if you take on average 100 billion stars, that's a low ball too. Well, I'll let you multiply 100 billion times 100 billion. That's kind of the minimum figure. We can't count those. All we can do is we can kind of estimate those. Well, they're innumerable as far as we're concerned, but that's a lot. That's a big number. More than anybody could have imagined in the past. People in the past thought there were only thousands of stars because that's all they could see at the time. Let's see. They're mentioned in Joseph's second dream in Genesis 37. Remember, you had the 12 stars, 11 stars bowing down to the 12th star. And even the sun and the moon bowed down to that one particular star, and that really ticked off his brothers and ticked off his mom and dad too, because everybody got it, what it meant. So are these literal stars here? Are they literal stars? Of course not. They represent each of the 12 suns, and the sun and the moon are not literal either. So is everything in the Bible literal? No, I get so tired of being accused of that. In fact, I was looking out on Rational Wiki just yesterday at my what page they have, short page they have of me, and that was just one thing they got. He thinks the Bible's literal. Everything in the Bible's literal. I don't believe that. They also had me working at both AIG and ICR, and had me being a head of one of the departments that ICR never was. So you can't trust what they write there, I guess. But it's amazing how. Everybody thinks that we think that everything in the Bible is literal, and there's clearly situations where it's not, and this is not a literal set of stars right here. It also appears in Balaam's prophecy there about a star, right? Is that a literal star? I don't think so. I think the stars in Genesis 15 and Genesis 1, those are literal, but I don't think this is a literal star either. Got to have some sense and look at it and understand what's being said, and it's pretty clear from all contextual hints there and understanding if these things represent someone, they can't not be stars, can they? Okay, other mentions. Deborah and Barak in Judges 5:20, they're singing their song of praise of victory won, and they said even the stars fought for them. Well, that's amazing. There's nothing in the account of the battle that suggested anything from the heavens helping them out. So I'm inclined to think it's a little poetic license here. It is a song that they're singing, and there's a lot of imagery, a lot of simile and metaphor in these sorts of things. So I'm inclined to think that's probably not a literal star either. In Job 38:7, they appear to be identified with angels, at least most people do, and some people then I've heard some people say, well, stars are always angels. Stars are not physical entities made out of normal matter, they're angelic beings. And I think that's going way beyond what is supposed to be meant there. Psalm 147 says that God counts them and he names them. And that's pretty amazing after we saw that they're innumerable, so how can you count the innumerable? Well, two suggestions there. One of them is the fact that it's innumerable from our standpoint. We really can't count them, but God could because there is a finite number of them. But hey, even if they are truly innumerable, God made them. God can count the innumerable. I think he's powerful enough to count the infinity. That's not a problem, but I don't think they're infinite. I just think they're innumerable from our standpoint. And but even better than that, he has names. You know, we have proper names for a couple hundred stars. Beyond that, we have designations. We have the guide star catalog that contains just millions and millions of stars. It's like, you know, GSC 24175387. It rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? That is not a name. That is a catalog entry or an indexing number. We have some pretty colorful names for some of the stars out there, and they have meanings associated with them many times. And I believe that God probably has meanings for that. And I've often wondered, in eternity, will I have a job to do? Will I be, I hope it's astronomy if I am, I could, and maybe my job would be to, find out some of those names, I could come back, hey everybody, meet Thursday afternoon. I got 50,000 more names to share with you. Well, I got some good ones here too. The Lord could point that one out. I call that one this, and that's his why. Oh yeah, I can see that. That would work out really well. Yes.
What was it? I've heard about this star register.
Star Registry, International Star Registry. It always advertises close to Christmas, don't they? That is unofficial. If you listen very carefully, you'll get your star chart, you'll get your little certificate, and they'll put it in a book. It will be housed in the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress will take anything, That kind of gives legitimacy to it. But the American Astronomical Society has taken a position on this. I don't think the International Astronomical Union has. It might have, but this is totally unrecognized by astronomers. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. It's not cool if you have it, but it's just that it's unofficial. I remember back in the late 50s, early 60s, some cereal company was giving away free square inches of Alaska to kids in cereal boxes. I don't know how official that was. If you still had the deed, could you go claim your square inch? I don't know. But all sorts of things they come up with. In Daniel 12, the saints are likened to the stars. They say, in some respect, we're like stars. And, well, I think in that respect, it's an allusion to literal stars, but it's not saying we're literally stars. It's saying we're like the stars in some manner. So that's literal stars in that particular case, of course. Switching over to the New Testament, there was a star that guided the Magi. You can give a whole talk on that. There have been whole books written on this. I've given some thought about writing my own book on it because there are several other books out there and they're all wrong. So the perfect book on the Christmas star isn't written because I haven't written it yet. All right, but maybe it's coming one day. We'll see. But there was a star. There was something that looked like a star in the sky. Maybe it's not the kind of star we would recognize today as a star. We've even equivocated what we call stars today. We define them a bit differently than they did in ancient times. A star in ancient times is any point-like or quasi-point-like source in the sky. It would be different from the sun and the moon were singled out because they're much bigger and much brighter, have a physical extent to them. But a comet is a hairy star. The word coma means hair, so it's a comet is a hairy star. Let's see, a nova is a temporary star, a guest star, a new star. Even the planets were wandering stars. Did you all saw Jupiter last night, right? Did it look like a star? Did Venus this morning look like it looked like a star, did it not? But it isn't. It's just brighter than the rest, and it moves around and does funny things. You can't see with the telescope what it's doing necessarily, but you can see the odd motions that it has. But in the ancient parlance, it's a star, and even today we sometimes call it the morning star or the evening star because of its similarity to it. What about artificial satellites and aircraft flying over? They certainly look like stars to me at night, the little lights moving along, so therefore these are biblically are stars as well. We find out in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that stars differ from one another in glory, and there the teaching is that we all have different gifts and different abilities. And again, I think those stars are literal in that particular case. And finally, in Jude, verse 13, it warns about people that are wandering stars. We don't know. You might be thinking, well, maybe those are planets. But I think most commentaries think these are referring to shooting stars, meteors. These things burn out quickly and they're gone and they're not stable. And that's a warning we ought to take to heart there. And then the book of Revelation mentions stars several times. One of these is the 7 churches in Revelation, chapters 1 through 3. It refers to 7 stars there representing each one of those. These are representations. When you get the book of Revelation, be very careful. There are a lot of things there that are symbolic, and these clearly are symbolic. And then also we find there that Jesus is the bright and morning star in Revelation 22. So you got a lot of stars being mentioned here, right? And there again, I think it's a symbolic thing. They're not saying Jesus is literally a star. I think everybody gets that it's, he is the bright and morning star, but it's a metaphor being used there. What about the purposes of the stars? Well, I think that they declare God's glory, and I got Psalm 8:3, Psalm 118:1, and Psalm 148:3 as evidence of that. And it's like the heavens are big billboards advertising the fact that there is a creator and he's powerful. All you have to do, are you paying attention? Are you getting the message from all of this? In Genesis 1:14 through 17, the day 4 account gives several purposes. They are to divide the day and night. It's alluded to in Jeremiah 31:35 as well. They are to be a division between night and day. And you may think primarily the sun doing that, but the stars, I think, play a role in that. The stars, or the heavenly bodies, are given for signs. And there's a bunch of stuff out there now dealing with this. Avoid those signs on the internet. They're pretty bad. Have you all heard about the sign on September 23rd of this year? Good. Nobody has. If you want to know more, go to our webpage at Answers in Genesis. I just put an article up recently. Had somebody pretty upset with me over what I wrote. I've just been through 9 ends of the world in my adult lifetime, and I'm getting tired of it. All right, let's see. We have seasons being mentioned there. We also find the timekeeping is indicated for days and for years and months, and so it's talking about calendric purposes. And provide light upon the earth. And we think, oh yeah, the sun does a good job, but the moon does too. If it's a moon full night, you can see pretty well. And if you let your eyes get dark adapted and you don't have trees over your heads, open up like in a desert, you can actually see very well by starlight. Sometimes my Grand Canyon raft trip, I get up in the middle of the night and get up and walk around, and I never turn on a flashlight. My eyes have been dark adapted for several hours. I can see quite well by starlight as I do that. Most people never get their eyes a chance to do that. Okay, what about these signs? Again, signs, one sign is navigation. The Magi had a sign in the sky. They said, we saw his star in the east. We've come to worship this king. Also, it can be used for weather prognostication. If you look at Matthew 16, 2 through 3, he's chastising the leaders of the Jews. And I'll put it I'll just kind of translate it in modern English. But he said, don't you have a saying along these lines? Red sky at night, sailor's delight. Red sky in the morning, sailor take warning. He said, you talked about the red sky. He said, you can see the signs in the sky and the weather, but you don't see the signs of the times, he said to them. So that was apparently something they used, heavenly signs, for these sorts of things. There is a testimony to God in Psalm 8 and 19. And then there is the coming judgment. I've got several verses there. Isaiah 13:10, Joel 2:10, Joel 3:15. By the way, Joel 2:10 there is quoted in Acts 2 by the Apostle Peter. Matthew 24:29, Revelation 8:12. This is not all of them, just some of the representative verses. I got a whole chapter in my book just on these apocalyptic things, advertising the judgment of the world. And some people get all excited that there were 4 total lunar eclipses, and that means the end of the world. Well, A, we're a couple of years past that and we're still here. And B, that sets the bar pretty low. I've seen scads, well over a dozen total lunar eclipses in my life, and I expect to see more. I think these signs, when they come, are not going to be simply eclipses of something or like this, or just some weird things happening in the sky that just happens really quite frequently. A lot of these are Rorschach tests. It's going to be something that's going to be quite startling. It's going to be inexplicable. It's really going to get your attention, which when I say inexplicable, the astronomers will not be able to give you a good explanation. Eclipses, we got to put a handle on that. The fact we can predict them so well, it kind of robs them of being a sign in my estimation. Obviously, what are the seasons we have here? When you think of seasons, what do you think of? Spring, summer, autumn, winter. But the word here for Hebrew word used, translated season, almost certainly doesn't refer to the climatic seasons. The word there, I believe, is moed, and it's the same word that refers to the festivals. Passover, the feast of the Passover, the word there is moed. And these festivals were based upon the time of the month of the calendar. They had a lunar calendar. They didn't have a solar lunar like we have, or a solar calendar like we have. They had a solar lunar, not a lunar actually. That's not quite right what I wrote there. But the Passover was always the 15th day of the month, which was a full moon. it bounces around on our calendar because we don't follow a lunisolar calendar, but on their calendar, it was always a full moon. If you're born on the 15th day of the month on that kind of calendar, it's always a full moon on your birthday. You can't avoid it on that thing. So if you want to know when Passover is going to be, or any of these other festivals, then you have to keep a calendar. That's where the record keeping comes in and looking up in the skies to do this. So in reality, it's talking about these festivals or these seasons. And we do the same thing. If I say football season, you're not necessarily going to think autumn. You're going to think late summer, autumn into winter, aren't you? But it's not the same. If I say a deer hunting season, you're not thinking of a climatic season. You're going to think of a week or two where it's legal to go out and get your limit on these things. It's a period of time for some appointed purpose. That's what the word season means. So even today, we use the word season in that context. We just don't think of that usually. We think of the climatic seasons on these things. And again, obviously, timekeeping and calendars are very important here. What I do find interesting, though, is the mentions from Job are of the heavenly bodies, and I didn't notice until a couple of years ago. So I read this in one of the books, and I checked out, and sure enough, I read this in a source I was looking at. When it mentions there in Job the heavenly bodies that I just talked about a few minutes ago, it's followed by weather-related phenomenon, talking about different times of the season. I totally missed that. Now, that's the sort of thing you see in farmers' almanacs and stuff. They'll talk about, well, the Pleiades will be up in October, and they tie it to the weather and so forth. This is lore going way back. Even in the book of Job, which is perhaps the oldest book in the Bible, they had something akin to a farmer's almanac tying weather phenomena, seasonal changes to the star changes. And that's what happens. You know, I love the constellation Orion, but I hate to see him in the early morning in late summer. He disappeared now behind the sun. He's going to pop out in August, well, actually by September. And I used to, when I was in grad school, I'd spend all night at the observatory. I'd be packing up, and it'd be getting light, and I could see Orion rising in the east. This is September. Why did I get kind of bummed when I saw Orion rising in the early morning sky? Because it was September. What comes after September? October. What comes after October? November. What comes after November? Winter. I don't like winter. I really don't. I was living in Indiana at the time. And so consequently, I was getting a little blue funk when I saw Orion rising, because I knew the seasons. I knew winter's coming. It may be warm now, but it won't be very soon here. You got to be very careful. They had to be very careful that it doesn't fall into pagan perversion. Very quickly then, I want to share some really cool thing with you. A little speculation here. Not so much on my part, but on other people. I'll tell you about what I like and don't like. Gospel of the Stars, I already told, did I tell you what I thought of that? I sugarcoated it, right? It's rubbish. Okay, bad stuff for the most part. However, the Gospel of the Stars is this belief that the original meanings of the constellations and the star names had some soteriological meaning given either to Adam or his son Seth, and it was preserved. And because they didn't have the scriptures yet, and you had to have the salvation message, the only problem is it got perverted and got turned into astrology, and so yada, 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 the whole thing. Well, this whole idea came about 150 years ago. A woman named Frances Rolleston kind of created this whole thing. If you want to learn more, I got 3 chapters of my book on it. I got some articles on our website about it. But I've studied this deeply over the past 35 plus years, and I find it seriously wanting for a number of things. It's bad for the most part, except there's one exception I'll grant you. There's one constellation called Hercules, but it's been called Hercules for about 17 centuries. In Ptolemy and other ancient sources, it's not Hercules. It's the kneeler, because you got this guy kneeling on one knee. And what's interesting is that his one heel is, he got his knee up, his heel is over the head of Draco, and we usually think of Draco as being the dragon, but that's a poor translation. Draco really is a root or word that refers to any kind of serpentine creature, and all the star charts it's depicted as a snake, not as a dragon at all. So you got a guy kneeling, and he's got his heel over top of a serpent's head. Now that might be coincidence, but it does jibe very well with the first messianic prophecy found in Genesis 3:15, does it not? And I think that's remarkable. So if there is anything representing this in the sky, the Gospel of the Stars, this would be it. It is information that would have been available from the very beginning, where the other stuff would be out of time, back out of place in that early time period. And the thing that's interesting there is that the people who promote the gospel of the stars generally don't touch this at all, or if they do, they touch it very lightly. And to me, that ought to be Exhibit A. So the one thing I hold out are those two constellations together, but because it comes straight from Scripture. The others I find very wanting. And there was a guy named Richard Proctor in the 19th century who wrote a book, several books. He was a popularizer of astronomy. There were people like that back in the 19th century. He wrote a number of books. His daughter Mary carried on after his death, and he's quoted quite a bit in amateur astronomy circles on astronomical lore. And I've gotten a couple of his books out and made copies and read them. And there's one published in 1870s, I believe, called Myths and Marvels of Astronomy. And when I read this one chapter, I heard a reference to it, so I had to get it, and I read it, and just my eyes popped out. I'm going to share with you something that Proctor pointed out. There's a very subtle shift that takes place in the locations of the stars. It's called precession, and as it turns out, there's a section of the sky visible to where Ptolemy lived, where a part of the year the known constellations are actually above the horizon, and there are some stars down here that are not named by him at all. And there's another part of the sky on the other part of the year where the stars that he names are actually below the horizon. So they can't be visible where he did his work because of the subtle shift of precession. We can take his 48 constellations and look at the center of the whole distribution, and we can calculate by our known precessional cycle when roughly when these constellations were codified and roughly what latitude. Around 35 degrees north, give or take about 2 degrees. And the middle part of the third millennium BC. It's 22nd century here. It might be 2500 BC, sometime in the middle to late 3rd millennium BC. Now that's very interesting because that latitude and that time period agrees very well with the flood, the end of the flood, where the ark probably landed, and when it landed, and also the Tower of Babel and disbursement of people right after that. It's you can't get this precise, but it's in the ballpark of that with the Masoretic text chronology that you have. It tells me that the constellations were over 2,000 years old, the ones that Ptolemy gave us, and he was handing down lore from before him with a few corrections that he made on it. But that kind of dates it, and that's very interesting. Now, I'll show you here is from Bayer's description. There is Hercules, and there's his foot. He did one plate for each constellation, so the serpent doesn't show up here, but the head of the serpent is right there below that foot. And you got other things like the thing he's holding in his hand, the club, and the lion skin that he has on. Those are embellishments, perhaps, if indeed this is some sort of representation of that first messianic prophecy. You all heard of the constellation Aquarius, called the water bearer? Well, here we have a depiction of the water bearer there in the sky. Yeah, I had to censor that for everybody. I didn't want to get anybody upset with me. First time I gave this talk, I did it at Bob Jones to a bunch of students, and I thought I better cover that one up going there. But you got this guy pouring out water. Now, nearby, below this, is another constellation. It's not showing up here, but that next constellation is a constellation of Pisces, the fish. So, as it turns out, the water bearer is pouring out water. It's kind of falling on top of these fish, as if fish really need water. So, Aquarius is here in the sky at a certain part of the year, and he sort of goes across the sky, and then the Pisces, the two constellations of fish, comes next. And then at that time, another constellation came by. It's called Argo. That was a ship of the Argonauts coming across. And it comes across the sky there. And I notice you only got about half of that showing up. Now, a few hundred years ago, astronomers, this big constellation got carved up into pieces. We've got the sail and the keel, but the pieces are still there, and it's recognized as an old constellation. And part of the ship seems to be missing there. There's something else there, and it's only part of the ship. But Proctor said, well, maybe there was some more of the ship here at one time that was there. What's interesting is above Argo, there was this big, long constellation called Hydra, and at the time this was done, it represented the celestial equator in the sky. It's a big line running across the sky like this, and perched on top of that is this dove, Columba the dove, right there above that monster. Then after that, there is this creature. These are kind of above it, but just to the left of the Argo, there is Centaurus. It's a half man, and half horse right there. And if you wanted to restore the rest of the ship, you'd have to take the back end of Centaurus away, which would turn him back into a man again, wouldn't it, I guess. Centaurs always creep me out anyway. And he's got this long shaft he's holding there, and you got an outline of another constellation. There is an animal on the end of this pike. It appears to be dead, and just beyond over here is another constellation called Ara. It's an altar with flames coming up off of it. Anybody see what might be going on here? This is Proctor's thing, and again, I find this interesting. So across the southern horizon, a certain good deal of the year actually, you have first of all Aquarius dumping out water, followed by the fish there, followed by a big ship, which possibly instead of just being the Argonaut ship could be a big boat with 8 people aboard maybe. And above that is this celestial equator. It looks like a horizon line. If you have a ship sitting here, you have a horizon line, and perched on top of it, flying around, you have a dove, a raven in this case, flying there. I'm sorry, not a dove, it's a raven. And then you have a man walking away from this boat with his pike, with a creature about to be laid down on top of the altar. And of course, I think you're biblically literate people, you know one of the first things Noah did when he came off the ark was to offer a sacrifice. When I read that a few years ago in Proctor's book, I thought, wow, that's really cool. There's a lot of things with the Gospel and the Stars, you have to force fit this stuff, and this one is a little bit, with the ship monkeying around with it, but the ship's kind of strange already. Anyway, and the centaur is kind of weird, so I have no problem with kind of doing that, but this stuff fits together pretty nicely. Now, don't come out of here thinking that I'm saying this is definitely a memorial to the flood, because I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying it could be. It could be. And I find that very compelling, more compelling than the Gospel and the Stars, which I think is mostly nonsense. Well, thank you very much for your attention today. I'm